I am joined today by Marc Menzies, MSP owner and CMMC extraordinaire. I'll let him introduce himself a little bit before we get started. Marc, want to kind of just share a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Martin. I'm the President and Chief Technology Officer of a hybrid solutions provider called Overview Technology Solutions. We are headquartered in Ronkonkoma, New York, which is on Long Island, and in Fort Wayne, Indiana. That's a new addition. And as you were saying, we do a lot with CMMC compliance. That makes our Indiana move, strategic insofar as that most of the GDP in Indiana is manufacturers, and a lot of manufacturers are DoD contractors. So really excited about that, and that's kind of what we're focused on right now.
Perfect. Excellent. And for those of you that have maybe are just jumping into day four, my name is Martin Perkins. I'm the channel director here at Kamanja. I do have a pretty extensive background in MSP, worked in it for 10, 12 years, ran one for about four or 5 years. So I know the stresses and pains that you guys go through, and as well as what the value props are and kind of what makes life easier and harder. And so that's kind of what I've been trying to bring to Kamanja. I've been working in the security and compliance space for about a year and a half now. And it's been really a lot of fun. We're being on the vendor side, but I'm happy I can bring some insight, hopefully, and make life a little bit easier for MSPs as we go through this process. So, all right. So day one, we talked about a really kind of high overview. We discussed, what risk management was, and kind of looked at the process of risk management. Day two, we dug a little bit more into the weeds, and then as far as identifying risks, figuring out how to actually get from the computer on the desk to what your actual risks are on the out into that. And then on day three, we talked about what do you do with those risks. So we talked about there's 4 different things that you can primarily do. You can avoid risk, you can mitigate risk, you can accept risk, or you can transfer risk. And we talked about some methodologies behind that, and obviously a high level. If anybody has any questions about any of that process up till now, or even today's content, feel free to reach out to me. I'm more than happy to help out. So today we're going to be talking about risk monitoring, which is often, I think I speak from experience on this, one of the most overlooked components of risk. It's one thing to go through and do your initial assessment, find out what you got going on, but then that feels like a nice, comfortable sweater that you're wearing that you feel safe now. But that being said, if you're not consistently validating that your risk is up to date, and that you're validating controls, then you're really leaving some gaps there. And so today like I said, we're gonna talk about risk management, and the definition of risk management is. Can you see my screen, by the way, Marc?
I can. I think I was having some technical difficulties earlier
Okay.
today, but it's still giving me a little trouble, but that's okay.
Okay, gotcha. So risk monitoring is monitoring, assessing, responding to changes in the risk landscape to ensure effective risk management. And obviously, this is important because changes happen from all vectors, right? Your business changes as you go through. You change vendors, you change, how you do business. You change because of a technological impact. You change because you had a breach, or the threat landscape changes. That's often one that's overlooked as well. Your company may remain relatively static functionally, but the threats the threats associated with your business have changed. They're evolving constantly, and so keeping on top of those is pretty critical. And so some of the key components of a risk monitoring framework are continuous risk assessment. And and as we've mentioned before, there is a lot more than just technical. We focus very highly on the technical in this boot camp because that's where MSPs live for the most part. So we're talking here about vulnerability scans, penetration tests, things of that nature. But that being said, there's a lot of additional components that go into validating your controls. So I'll touch on that as we go through, but I want to make sure I reiterate that and make sure it's something that people are aware of, because the slides, you'll see a lot of technical content, but that's not all we're talking about here. And so some of the examples of that are gathering analyze data from various sources, such as security logs, threat intelligence feeds, things that you would feed into a SIEM and do some analysis of the logs there. There's a lot of information that comes from vulnerability scanning as well. Obviously, the 0 days come and go, kind of like the wind. So when you're doing vulnerability scans, that identifies your CVEs for you, things of that nature. It also identifies changes in the landscape, and there's a lot of good products out there. This is in no way, espousing any of them, but things like, change management platforms. I know LionGuard does some of that stuff. Auvik does some of that stuff. Monitoring changes and identifying when things have occurred is very critical, because while there may not be an actual issue, a change in configuration can have a massive impact on compliance that a security scan may not identify. So doing continual risk assessment scanning is pretty important. Mark, do you have anything that you want to share, chime in on that at all?
Yeah, so just let me know when you're actually going on to the next slide. I'll just follow along, even though I'm
No,
not
no
seeing
worries.
your screen, which is fine.
I'm still
So
on that key
yeah,
components.
yeah, so to mirror what you were saying, there's nothing consistent in life except for change. So, there could be a change in the compliance framework that you have. There could be a that you're following. There could be a change in the New York State DFS 23 NYCR 500. They just put through changes to that compliance, that framework. They moved the date to which you need to respond forward, luckily by 2 months. They added some things, they removed some things. So even if nothing in your environment changes, sometimes the framework itself changes too. So like I said, there's nothing consistent in life except for change. Yeah, that's sort of what we're seeing, is that as the ships are rising per se, the frameworks themselves and the compliance requirements are increasing, and it's going to continue to happen until we get to some sort of singularity in the future where everything is perfect, which I actually don't think is ever going to actually happen. We'll continue to work towards that, but we'll never really get there. And if you make impossible to achieve requirements in any of these frameworks, no one's going to actually pass. No one will be compliant. So you're going to see this constant uptick, even if your environments don't change. But
well, and that's like PCI is one, you have 3.2, and now you're 4.0 comes out in March, I think. And so that's a good example of your situation not changing at all as far as functionally, but the requirements that you're upheld to are modifying. FTC safeguards is another one. You may have been adherent. You may be one of the initial entities that were governed by FTC safeguards, but with this new revision that came into effect in June, that changed a lot of both who was covered, but also what you have to do in it. There added additional technical components to a much larger degree. So things of that nature are great examples of that. So I'm changing slides now. So some of the things are early warning systems, real-time alerts, and this honestly, Mark, is I think you guys have some pretty good systems in place after having witnessed kind of how you guys do business, and so what are some early warning systems that you guys utilize from a tool set to kind of give you a heads up on when things are popping up that need to be addressed from a change perspective?
So are you, so like, if you're talking about, emerging risks and such, we have we're not large enough to have our own internal SOC, right? As most solution providers aren't rather, a lot of them outsource it. So, a lot of times we'll see that from the M365 side, we'll see that from the endpoint side and coming in some sort of alert. And that's from another vendor, whether it be like Huntress or a RocketCyber or Blackpoint or ConnectWise's SOC. That information comes in, and and then it needs to be either they'll say, hey, we took this lightweight action, like we've isolated something, or we see a thing that someone logged in from the Netherlands. Is this person traveling? Things like that, and the part that we have had to constantly jump through hoops to make sure that things are perfect with is the consistency, especially if you're using multiple vendors. A vendor might change the way that they're communicating something. Some way that you were parsing something before with a priority level, when it comes in, might not work anymore. If the vendor changes the way that they parse their subject line. I'm sorry, they put their subject line in or something like that. So we had a few alerts that didn't end up becoming anything large, but recently that we missed because it's severity level, because the parsing was being done improperly, because it was a change made that we didn't know about.
Mm-hmm.
And we've had some discussions and such, but those real-time alerts are very important to us. So those are some of the examples, is that a third-party SOC, a human looking at it when it's 3 a.m. or something like that, or when the rest of our service team are performing their services, help desk, professional services, things like that, are where we see a lot of value and such.
And I think to layer on top of that, the change management platforms, when we mentioned, you touched on our, the last slide, are another component of that, because when you're looking at risk, an alert is not just, hey, we might have a security breach here. It's, hey, something's changed that might result in a vulnerability down the road. And so, good.
I was going to say that's actually an interesting discussion that we were having the other day. So I'm part of the working group for CompTIA's Trustmark, and they're still in the early stages of beginning to assess MSPs with their new version of it and such. And one of the big conversations we had the other day, which I'm allowed to talk about, was around change management and how do we measure different aspects of an MSP's maturity level and such. And one of the conclusions that we came to, at least from my perspective, was change management. And change management isn't perfect by any means. So you can have something changed in a firewall that maybe didn't go through the proper change management process that help desk did, as opposed to professional services. Didn't go through the proper process. Is this a threat? Is this not a threat? Who logged in? Why'd they log in? And that can create a lot of noise. So having a good change management system down, having good documentation down, and also identifying when change was made and how it was made or why it was made is really important too. Context is king here, because somebody logging into a firewall and creating a new rule could could go one of two ways. There could be one of two reasons for it. And being able to easily have this, having visibility into that, and having that visibility be something that's easy for you to achieve without having to do too much work, makes people not just hit ignore on everything. Because then if everything is an alert, nothing's an alert.
Right, and that goes back to something we talked about in some of the previous talks, is validating controls and making sure that you're able to ensure that the control, if change management controls, obviously that is a control that you put in to mitigate risk, and to validate that your change management is actually is achieving what it's desired to. One of the things we talked about, from a very base level, is you have a control where you're talking about managing access to a server room, and you have access logs, or maybe with a key fob that tracks who goes in and out, but then having a camera to validate that there's people not tailgating their way in. Change management, there also needs to be ways to audit that and make sure that the change management process has been followed. So even just spot checking or a holistic audit of changes to client firewalls or in particular specifically internal control sets is very important. So, and then one of the things you really need to make sure you have a feedback loop to report incidents and concerns. So we like we just talked about, if you have a change management process, making sure that there is a process that you can go through to validate that the things were handled in the way they should be, not just a, hey Bob, did you follow change management, right? There needs to be some sort of mechanism that you can actually engage to validate that things are being done the right way, and any security incidents obviously are being processed the same way. And again, we talked with Shell yesterday about how most frameworks are around 50 to 60% technical control, but the rest is primarily policy driven, and making sure you have those right policies in place and engaged is key. So I am advancing to the next slide.
I'm good now, by the way, so I'll let you know.
All right, just okay. So I'll click, and then we'll go from there. So this is a timely identification. Goodness gracious, that word seems challenging to me today. Timely identification of changes. And I think really this kind of goes back to what we talked about very heavily about the environment changing, and that has a lot of impact on how things are handled within an organization. So monitoring market trends to identify economic uncertainties that may impair the financial stability of an organization. Because again, I mentioned we've talked about risk a lot. When it comes to technical controls, there are a lot of risks that are associated with companies that aren't associated with them. And those, when you're looking at, in particular, when you're looking at disaster recovery and disaster preparedness, those risks have to be very heavily looked into. So if you're engaging a client and you're talking about, risk management, what it takes them to, what happens when markets change, when things change. Those are conversations that, even how you're going to react with them in the role of a provider, right? In the event of some sort of financial downturn or things like that. We had a lot of things in our contracts that kind of gave some wiggle room, or at least address what things look like in the event of a financial downturn for the market. So, and then adaptive risk response is mitigating cybersecurity risk by adjusting security calls based on real-time threat intelligence. And so when you're talking, pardon me, let me get a drink real quick. That goes back directly to the technical landscape changes we talked about before. New threat actors, new vulnerabilities. Go ahead, Mark.
I was going to say I want to let you finish, but there's something actually on that first point that I
Oh, go ahead. Sure.
talk about here. So risk happens outside of IT. We were doing a third party risk management. Having a discussion with a third party today that was hired by a financial institution. It's a long story, but it was a really positive conversation. But one of the discussions that we had that I tried to spearhead a little bit was, risk for IT doesn't start and end with IT anymore. There's a lot of things that it comes into. And you were mentioned in here, identifying economic uncertainties and how it may impair the, stability of the organization. If there's an economic downturn and maybe, you have an employee or something that's maybe over leveraged a position or is upside down on a house or this or that, and maybe they're, not getting paid super well or this or that, people can be coerced to do things, which is why, people in certain positions, we generally recommend, hey, credit check be done. Not just at the higher time or date, but, later when there's finances involved. If you're hiring a CFO, make sure they're not going to rob you blind, because they, their credit score is, 506 and they, recently declared bankruptcy and need to pay the loan shark type of thing. I know it's an extreme example, but I can't tell you the number of times that we've had conversations recently where it's not that the threat actor took money, but the insider threat took money. The insider took money, and and it was in something that was an obscure hole in their process that they're like, I wouldn't have even thought of that. Or I mean, the business owner saying that. So, monitoring risk in a way that, in that way too, doing those yearly background checks, things like that is very important as well. I know it's a different way of answering that, but that you'd find out later if somebody ended up having that that lower credit score, that you wouldn't know until after the problem happened.
Well, I think that's a great dovetail into, like, internal threats are often overlooked when you're doing risk assessments. I mean, I think a lot of people see themselves as us against the world. And I'm not saying that you should treat your employees adversarially at all. Just understand, though, like what Mark was saying, there are situations where, whether it be economic or, there's a whole host of reasons why individuals do things, whether it be just for their own gain, or to get themselves out of a hole. But internal threats are all something you need to make sure you're aware of and creating control sets for as well. It's a pretty, honestly, the internal risk is kind of a deep hole to go down if you start digging into it, because you have people that just make bad decisions to actual nefarious, people looking to, sell intellectual property for value. And so that's something I think that's a great point that a lot of folks don't really take into account, is when there is that internal risk or the internal threats when they're looking at their risk profiles.
Yeah, the character of your employees and the people and your coworkers and your clients, employees and coworkers and your clients. I think that you have your everyday face and you have the who you are and how you function, and then you have who you are and how you function when you're backed into a corner, and that becomes very unpredictable. And so having the proper detections in place for those things and that proper proactiveness in those conversations is very important, because once you MFA everything and DLP everything and this and that, there is always going to be that residual risk that can't be handled by a technical control. It needs to be handled by administrative controls, and there needs to be monitoring behind that, and that requires conversations and people to file policies and such.
And this is kind of tangential, but I think this goes back to how important culture is to a company. I mean, proactively managing it as you go through. I think, especially in organizations in a growth spurt, it becomes challenging to keep your beat on the culture, and it gets very easy to kind of lose touch with the individual staff and how they feel connected to that culture. And I think maintaining culture is one of the big. It's not truly a control set, but it's a big mitigator when it comes to ensuring that those internal risks are minimized, because keeping people on the same page, keeping them connected. Isolation is one of the things that often triggers these kind of internal risks for going off. So. Um,
And I want to just speak to that for a second. I don't think it's just growth. I think it's just change, like rapid change. You might
right.
say, okay, well, how do you define growth? Is it aligning with your ideal client profile better? You're doing a bunch of offboardings, onboardings. You're saying, hey, maybe these team members aren't, the ones who you want to continue to grow your company with. Things like that. You might not increase or decrease your headcount at all, but you can have a ton of dynamic change by numbers alone, meaning increase or decrease endpoint amount, but you might have a ton of dynamic change there. And that dynamic change is when those processes can be broken, things sneak through. That's when we find to see a lot of that happening, and it's not necessarily because of growth or shrinking. It's just change in general.
Mhm.
So.
Yeah, it's hard for change is hard in general. Growth is one of those aspects, but you're completely right. Change in general is something that needs to be managed. A lot of folks go into say, hey, we're going to do X, Y, and Z now, without putting a change management process in place. And I think that's a great observation. Next thing we're talking about is resource allocation optimization. And I think, Mark, you and I talked about this on a webinar you and I did some time ago about right sizing your security, and making sure that you're spending the money where it needs to be spent. And so this is really a key thing, because this is also one of the functions of a risk assessment, is to go through and making sure that you know where your actual risk is. We've talked several times throughout the course of this course. That was poor word choice. But the fact that understanding where your risk is where you should be spending your money. There's a lot of tools out there there's a lot of shiny tools out there that can be either immensely useful from a risk perspective, or a very shiny tool in your stack. And making sure that you're actually applying the right control sets and technical controls, so they actually address the risk in a kind of cascading fashion, starting with the riskiest stuff first and moving their way down. You had a head nod there. I think you have more to add there, Mark.
Yeah, so knowing where your actual risk is, over time, and as I believe a bunch of us have gotten more experience in this, is you're right. The shiny tools will give you essentially a template. And it will say, here's, and frameworks will give you a template, but only you and your leadership team and your employees and such know your organization. So there's going to be things that the template isn't going to show you. And you shouldn't be concerned or embarrassed by maybe you didn't know if something was a risk last year. Why didn't I think of that? Or you'd be on a webinar and one of us mentions something, or I'm on a webinar and somebody else mentions something. How did I never think of that? I'll give you an example is that, we have rules in place and such ourselves and our clients for, if somebody has a forwarding rule in place, right? It'll get caught immediately, for whatever reasons there. But, things that are manually BCC'd, maybe it's like a personal email or something like that for like one of our employees, like that's something that we'd want to see too. And we don't have a way of measuring that right now. Now I do, but like we didn't. And someone mentioned it somewhere and I was like, a client of mine actually said, well, how do you, prevent this from happening? I'm like, that's a really good point. We don't actually. That would be something that we would look at after the fact and see what our statistics are on that. So we have a rule in place now to measure that or to capture that information and then measure it in the KPI, little breakage thing. But the point is that like you are, when you go through this continuous process of risk assessment, you're always going to come up with new things. And it should be something that you should be embracing rather than using as like a KPI on how well you did the first time. Because again, The only thing consistent in life is change. But anyway, to Martin, to what you were saying.
Well, and I agree completely because it goes right in the continuous improvement component here is that even if a control hasn't failed or shown itself to be deficient doesn't mean to be reviewed. Just because you didn't have a breach involving email doesn't mean your email policies don't need to be reviewed. And that doesn't mean you're doing it all the time, but you need to have some sort of cadence that you're reviewing policies, that you're reviewing control sets, because two things, well, multiple things, but two big things happen. You guys, as MSPs, evolve and get better. You learn of new tool sets. You increase your skill sets. Your engineers go to more training, and that's a big thing because there's a lot of new skill set that can be applied to some of these controls from the time they were initially set, as well as again the threat landscape changes consistently. So continuously making sure that even though you haven't had a breach or you haven't had a failure in a control doesn't mean the control is still sufficient, and that's why continuous improvement is key. And so and I'm going to go back to this, and I mentioned this early on in the course, but risk management is work. It's to do this properly, and that's why when we talk about us MSPs moving up stack, this is why it's a higher value product line for your clients, because this is thought leadership. This is unpacking a business to a degree that most companies haven't done it. Because it's getting to the point where applying a stack is getting commoditized to the point where it's going to be really, really challenging to kind of maintain the margins that we in the MSP world have gotten used to, and that can maintain our rate of growth that we're used to. That's the biggest part, right? Without those margins, you can't hire staff like we used to. There's a whole lot of kind of restrictions that the commoditization of a lot of our tool sets and support sets are imposing upon us. So moving up stack is the way to kind of maintain those margins and continue to grow at the rates that we're looking for. So
some of the issues, Martin, that we have when doing third-party risk assessment, acting as a third party doing risk assessment, and we have a client we're working with right now, and I'm going to estimate right now about 70% of the work that we're doing with both the client and the MSP who brought us in to do that third party assessment, essentially, which includes risk assessment. It's just gathering everything and putting it in the right place. And if they had a process in place to continuously update the documentation, to continuously put it in one place, to continuously do this, do that, the 70% of that work we wouldn't have needed to do. It would have been closer to 10%. And in chasing cats and all that stuff, herding cats rather, is very difficult. And so talking about eating into margins, that's for that particular project, it's killing us. Just if they just had everything in one place, it would have been so much easier, and it's so much easier said than done. And so again, adding services and keeping your margins, that's one of the big things, is that things sometimes take longer than you think, and risk management, to your credit, is work. A lot of work, more work than most people think it is.
Well, and that kind of gives me an easy into the Kamanja platform as a risk management platform as a whole. That's one of the reasons why you use a tool like Kamanja, is once you've ingested it, then maintaining and continuing, like Marc was saying, everything's, where everything's at. Everything's in one place for managing change, managing incidents, setting cadences for reviews of policies, things like that. All that can be managed within a platform like Kamanja. It's really critical that you have some methodology to keep that all in one spot, because I dovetailing into that is continuous, right? I talked with Shell yesterday about how a lot of the MSP space sees audits as a monthly or an annual process. You come in, you do your audit, and then next year we'll come back and do another one and see where you sit. And without continuous monitoring from end of audit A to beginning of audit B, there's a massive gap, especially from a risk perspective, that you're exposing your client to there. And so continuous monitoring of their risk is something that is pretty critical. And the folks that are in here, they're probably starting to hear me broken record but it really is key, because risk management is not a annual process. It is a constant process, because that one change to your business that exposes a large amount of yourself can break the business. And if you're not managing that change and the risk associated with it as you go through it, then it's going to be it can be massively detrimental to your client base. And so this takes it into like the next, honestly, it's a kind of a nice segue: clarity and simplicity. Being able to communicate to the stakeholders of your clients what the risk data is, right? Through visuals and charts graphs, things of that nature. Being able to actually sit down and illustrate to them where their primary risks lie is a big key to this kind of this continuing improvement. One thing, it helps you laying out a roadmap when you have all the risks laid out in front of your client is really easy. Especially with when you've graded the risks and you've said, all right, here's a massive thing, the impact is huge, the likelihood is very high, the impact on our business is going to be huge if we don't do this, and so we set this up first, and then we start working our way through the roadmap for a client. So and then as you do continuing risk assessment, those outputs of reports and things like that will drive continuing updates to their infrastructure, projects, things of that nature. And then making sure your metrics align with their business. I think that's something, honestly, that a lot of MSPs miss when they're doing risk management. They go in with what they see as important. I think all of us fall victim at some point in our MSP career. You walk into a business and you know what's important. You know what would be a big thing for you, but the client's priorities don't align with that. And so being able to align the risk metrics to what's actually important. And who was it? It was Matt Lee in our very first session that talked about risk drives business. And he's like, no, he was citing a quote. It's profit that drives business. So being able to tie risk to profit is where you're really going to gain your traction. Do you have anything to add to that, Marc, at all?
No. I'm 100% on the same page, and he's that's 100% right. Yes, he's right. The one thing I want to mention, though, is that the metrics, they align with the client's business. I think that, and I don't know if you spoke about this on any of the previous webinars, but the importance of compensating controls. You can say, we have a client who turning MFA on for certain accounts. They're non-named service accounts that perform a user interacting function. Normally is a big no, like no users touching this account, they need to be logged in with their name. But if for this particular function, we really can't. So what's our compensating control? Well, we have to have MFA on it, but you say, okay, well, this is coming from a trusted IP. We have these other controls in place, so we're going to turn MFA off on this. We're going to put it in this group. We're going to put the description down, and we're going to document this in such a way. I think that a lot of times someone will come into a client and say, hey, you have to have MFA on everything. Mm-hmm. Most of the time that's true. But if you have a good compensating control in place, it's just as good. It's one of the reasons that NIST CSF, in some way, shape, or form, it says, hey, you don't need to cycle your passwords if you are, monitoring your threat landscape properly and you have MFA on things, and you, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just like, well, that doesn't make any sense. Well, actually, it does. So that's, I don't know. I want to do a quick aside about compensating controls, and that if what you're trying to bring to the client doesn't align with their business, you should be comfortable enough, if you understand the control, to put a compensating control in place, document it, monitor it, and make sure that what you put in place, even if it kind of diverges from what the norm is, it doesn't mean it's bad. You just have to monitor it. To Martin's what are you saying?
Well, and I think actually that echoes kind of what Shell mentioned yesterday when we were talking about in HIP environments where you have one terminal that has maybe 7 different people using it throughout through the same shift. It's not like they shift out through shifts. It's like people have to use that terminal to check people in, check people out, pull up records, whatever that looks like. And having an individual login for that machine for each person is not it's not conducive to business. It doesn't make any sense to log in and log out because three people may touch the machine within 5 minutes. And so having individual logins for the platforms you're using, maybe a compensating control there, and then locking things down that way. So definitely, when we talk about aligning to business, there's definitely a risk, a cost benefit analysis that has to be made, and there may even be some risk acceptance, because that's where that came up in the conversation. Because compensating controls are great when you can do them, but in some instances there may just be to say, we're gonna accept this risk based on the fact that it impacts our business so tremendously that we can't make money if we don't have this function, that kind of thing. That doesn't mean there's no other ways that can be thought about it, but in that instance, that's how they're going to run it. So,
and coming back into that, to speak to that, if you're going to be accepting that risk, and I'm sure you said this before, documenting it is so important.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a conversation with your client, hey, should we get tornado, insurance or something like that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's a once in every 100 years event, or every 1,000 year, whatever you want to consider it, and then you put that that risk calculation together. What should we be spending, say, under this number? Document it, because at the end of the day, Murphy's Law says that actual thing's going to happen if you accept that risk. Make sure you document it. Make sure that for example, with climate change, maybe there is a higher risk now of there being a tornado in a certain area. Maybe that equation does change. Maybe that is back on the table. Maybe you wouldn't accept that risk anymore. But have it documented, because when the thing happens, you want to make sure you can CYA also.
Mm-hmm. Well, and also this kind of leads over to insurance, even like when you're answering questionnaires. I mean, back to your MFA comment, that's been in the news about MFA. Do you have MFA on it? Yes, we do have MFA. Is it on everything? Well, and yes, but in these particular instances, we have these 5 accounts that have compensating controls, and here they are. Making sure you're being very transparent there, because that can very quickly bite you in the hind end if you're not being transparent with those things, and there is an incident. In particular, with one of those accounts, that would very obviously draw things out quickly, or even just during an audit when they find these 4 accounts that could very, very, very much, very potentially nullify a payment, just because you said we had MFA but you didn't. So something else to be aware of, at least when you're going through. And so excuse me. And then trend analysis. This is something that I've noticed a lot. In HIPAA is a big one, and we touched this a couple of times. Where HIPAA is, and this is something that I've heard from multiple vectors, that HIPAA is a journey, not a landing spot. And so being able to survive a HIPAA audit, if you've documented where you're at, documented your plan to move forward, and documented the progress that you've made, that's a great way to kind of illustrate some of those things. So it's being able to illustrate that you've been moved from A to B, that you've been improving. It has a whole host of positive implications to show positive progression, whether it's just you dealing with vendors or clients that want to see something like that, or you're dealing with something like HIPAA, where you actually have to demonstrate that so substantially in that process. It's critical. So having some sort of framework that tracks where you were versus where you are now is critical. And I'm going to go back to kind of a platform like Kamanja that can give you that ability to say, all right, here was my report from last year, or January 1. It's now March 1. We've done some evaluation. We're going to re-report. You can look at the change revisions on your reporting and see where you've gone, where you started out, where you came from, and then where you're at now, to actually illustrate some of those things. Everything in Kamanja has revision tracking across the board. So any changes that you've made, both from your risk analysis to your policies, to everything that has happened in your organization, there's iterations of that you can track. And then actionable insights, obviously, that's key when you're going through. Any reporting needs to have the ability to, all right, here's my marching orders. Here's what I got to do as an outcome of this. Anything to add to that, Marc, at all?
No, I have nothing to add actually over there.
All right, wonderful. Hopefully that's because I'm covering well.
I'm speechless. It's the first time.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and I bet you money that I did not get that my session is logged me out. So give me 1 second. I'm gonna get logged into the platform. And I just want to kind of show you what when I'm talking about action items and things of that nature, and I want to show kind of dig back into that present or the reporting that we have in Kamanja, and just show you kind of where you're at there. Give me
I guess
one
in the
moment.
meantime, I'll make a comment about, you mentioned that, HIPAA's, journey not a destination, and you have to document the progress that's made, and that's because they don't have like very clear, this is exactly what you need to do. It's not very prescriptive. It is, but it's not as much as
Mm-hmm.
other like NIST 800-171, for example, which I know a little bit about at this point. Doesn't live in my brain rent free, but the it's not just HIPAA that's that way. Many of these frameworks, many compliance requirements are evolving into that. Did you do better than last time? Did you do
Mm-hmm.
better than last time? Because ultimately, a lot of our job is to make sure that, and this is what I tell our clients, is that you want to make sure, if you think of this as a spectrum, and the person at the top is the most secure and the person at the bottom is the least secure. You want to make sure you're not the low-hanging fruit. You want to make sure you're not in that 50%, 50th percentile, above bottom 50th percentile. But if tides are rising, what you did a year or two ago that puts you in that top 50%, that the 25th percentile, the 10th percentile, might land you in the bottom 20 in a year or two.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of frameworks are starting to gear more towards that improvement, rather than that static requirement of a particular control being met by XYZ. Especially as the framework itself evolves, to what I was saying. Trustmark is that way, is the first iteration of this, where the assessments are being done, this, this is geared towards MSPs. Year 2, year 3, year 4 assessments are going to be different, because the expectation is that the MSPs are going to have things documented, that they're going to keep up with their documentation, that they're going to evolve and allow for everything to get more complex over time. And they're not alone in that. That's kind of what I'm seeing across the industry.
Gotcha. Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm sorry I was a little distracted, so I came not connecting it well because I was trying to bring up this report here. But I want to do here, one moment. Sharing my. I'm going to stop sharing this screen and share my other screen. All right. So what I've done is I've gone into our risk management. I've gone into our risk management section here, and I've gone to the results. So here's all the assessments we have in here, but here are the results. And in the results section, I have the supplier chain risk assessment here, and I made a change in it just to make sure that I had, when I download a report, here's the report that was done 223 done 2020 or 220 of this year, and this is the report that I just generated because there was a change to the information within that report. So every time you're going through, and you'll see, you'll see lots of changes as they occur, as you're remediating risk, especially if you're doing proper ongoing. You'll be able to kind of track. You'll have incremental changes based on the risks that you've modified, or how many you've modified, and what your cadence is for that. But when I click on the download, I'll be getting the opportunity to download my new risk report. And I want to illustrate specifically. Here's the name of my report, but here's all here's when it was created. Here's the here was a risk score change. So this was when the initial thing was generated. So that's going to be the kind of the baseline. Any changes to that, and it's going to tell exactly what was changed. So the risk score was changed to 9 of a particular asset within the organization. So and that changed the residual risk score as well. And so it's going to tell me exactly what's happening. So when you're looking for documentation of change management and what's gone on with the organization, I mean, again, you're going to have the same things we've shown you previously in the reporting, the heat maps, the summary, all the things that go with it, as well as all the different risks. And this one particularly focuses on vendors. So here's a Kiva law, and here's the different risks associated with that particular vendor. And then it's going to scroll through till we get to a new header. And there's a lot of risk. Again, when we talked about there's a lot of work here, There is a lot of work. Now, Kamanja does a lot of the work for you by generating a lot of the vulnerabilities, the risk, the threats, vulnerabilities, and risks associated. But you need to probably make sure that they're appropriate for the organization that you're evaluating it for, and B, you're managing them properly. So then we move into AWS, and then you have a header for that group. So that's literally what I had for today. I want to make sure that if the group has any questions, JP, Seth, Degley, anybody have any questions that before we move on to concluding this boot camp for risk management, or if Mark has it, you have anything else you want to interject before we move on? I'd love to hear final thoughts or anything like that from anybody involved.
I'll jump in and say that at the very least, you just need to start something somewhere, and this would be a good spot to kind of encourage anybody that's looking to do anything, that they just got to jump in and at least get started. I mean, the whole idea of, how to eat an elephant just one little bite at a time. This is exactly what we all need. Thank you. Appreciate
that. And that being said, like starting out with CIS as a framework, just to something to begin that journey down and begin the evaluation process on whether or not the control sets are being met and things of that nature. It's a great way to do that. But exactly to your point, you just have to start somewhere. Hopefully this boot camp gave some folks out there some grounding, some footing to really kind of start down that journey. Degley, unmuted. Are you something to say?
No, I was just going to say that I second Sir John Paul's comments.
Excellent. Mark, you were going to say something. I want to make sure I'll give you the final word.
Is it time for the final word?
Let's go ahead and do that.
Love it. So I mean, so we went through our CMMC thing for our high security enclave, and that's not even our entire organization, and it took a tremendous amount of time. And no matter what you do internally, you don't have unlimited resources. You have limited resources. And one of the most important takeaways that I have from that is that if you're going to do it, it's going to take a long time. You got to eat it one bite at a time, like you're trying to get that elephant, eat that elephant. But ultimately, you do have to if you're doing this internally, you have to budget for that as well. It does take time. It does take resources, and those resources have a non-zero expense. And if you try to do it all at once, if you try to do it too quickly, and you're trying to meet unreasonable goals, you're going to end up not doing well. You're going to end up failing. You're going to end up missing major swaths of what you should have seen. So you really need to trust the process with this. And then once you have it, you have to maintain it at all costs, because this now is something that'll make or break us as MSPs. In the far future, clients are going to be wanting to see this information. More clients, some of them want to see it now for us. More clients are going to be wanting to see this information. They're going to be wanting to do businesses with MSPs or HSPs or whatever that have certain compliance requirements met, that those are able to be assessed and measured. And if you try to do it too quickly, you're going to end up running into a big problem. And I think that this is going to, I keep thinking, oh, it's anytime now. It's when it happens, a lot of people are going to be left in a not so great place. And if there is any sort of financial uncertainty in a company and then they have to do this, it could cause a big problem for the organization. So get started now, even if you do a teeny bit at a time, even if you're just getting your asset list into some sort of GRC platform, even if you're just doing the integration, even if you're just having a short meeting and you discussed one control, do something.
And I guess it was the last word, but I'm going to have to piggyback on that because there was a lot of great stuff you put in there. Even if it's just you're getting your own house in order, and validating, because most of us have really great scientific minds, and I mentioned this before a couple times in previous sessions, that blinders are blinders. They're called blinders for a reason. They're areas where there are people out there that have gone through meticulously and developed control sets and identified avenues of threat that we may not have thought of. And so making sure you're using some sort of platform to go through and look at this just to be systematic as you go through it really helps a lot. I think one other thing, when you talk about budgeting, and I'm going to couple this with what JP said, budgeting time is probably the most critical component of this, because I've been in MSP shoes. I know there's always holes on our time. There is never a second in your day where there's not something to do, period. If you don't allocate that time and then dedicate the time you've allocated to actually making this thing happen, it just will not happen. Because it's not easy, and there's always going to be something. Oh wait, this client's down. This contract needs to be reviewed. X, Y, and Z. There's always going to be something, and so making
it's an
sure
investment.
Exactly, 100%. And so getting your own house in order. And one more thing that you mentioned, saying, Mark, you said clients want to work with you. I think we're going to get to the point where you won't have an option to work with MSPs that don't have this down the road. I think this is the future. If you've listened to the rhetoric coming out of the policymakers that be, more and more is going to be held accountable to us, and more is going to be expected of us. And there's going to be a shift in liability, I think, onto us, which is onto MSPs, put it that way. That I think we don't have a choice but to move into this echelon of thought leadership and understanding the risks, because we're going to be held accountable for them. So with that, I'm going to conclude this boot camp. Thank you so much for everybody that joined. It's been wonderful. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to martin@kamanja.io, or just book a meeting. I'm happy to just give any kind of feedback or things like that. If you just want to have a chat, I'm more than happy to go through that. So thanks everybody, and we'll talk again soon, hopefully.
Thank you, Martin.
Thanks, guys.